Now we will continue with the bone marrow and hematopoiesis. That let's suppose here is your bone marrow or house, right? And there is your peripheral circulation. Now, a few important points related with the stem cell. You know, understanding of bone marrow stem cell, the pluripotent stem cell, already you know they will divide into multipotent stem cells, and these multipotent stem cells will divide into, yes please, committed stem cells, and these committed stem cells will divide into colony forming units, right? These are all stem cells. These dotted lines say that these cells have a capacity to maintain their own pool, right? Self-renewal capacity in these cells. This was pluripotent stem cell. This was these two multipotent. This was common myeloid stem cell. This was your common lymphoid stem cell. This was again, please, can you tell me? This was pro-natural killer. Then there was pro-T cell. And this was pro-B cell, again stem cells. Is that right? Here this was, yes, erythroid, megakaryoid, and basophilic stem cell. Here it was granulocyte, monocyte stem cell, and here it was eosinophilic stem cell. And we have already discussed that how they will go into morphological blast forming units and colony forming units, and eventually into morphologically recognizable cells, precursors, and final product, mature product. Now the point which I want to highlight here, that all the stem cell in the bone marrow, they have very important implications as far as pathology is concerned. For example, if due to some reason these stem cells don't multiply well, right, or these stem cells don't multiply well and they are hypoproliferative or they are destroyed by the T lymphocytes, then these stem cells cannot multiply with enough speed to maintain the RBCs, WBCs and platelets number into peripheral circulation. The condition will be called aplastic anemia. Aplastic anemia. So what is aplastic anemia? Aplastic anemia is a misnomer because it is not aplastic anemia. It should be ideally called aplastic pancytopenia. Pancytopenia means that in the blood RBCs, WBCs and platelets, all cells are reduced. If RBCs, WBCs and platelets, all three types of cells are reduced in the blood, we say there is pancytopenia. Now, if there is stem cell destruction or stem cell dysfunction and it is showing hypoproliferative dysfunction, then what will happen? That in the blood RBCs, WBCs and platelets will be less. And we'll say the peripheral blood is showing pancytopenia and bone marrow will be showing hypoplasia or aplasia. Bone marrow will be hypocellular or hypoplastic. So whenever bone marrow is hypoplastic and blood is showing pancytopenia and there are no other abnormal cells in the bone marrow on the peripheral blood picture, we say person is suffering with aplastic anemia. So this is one of the stem cell dysfunction. Another type of stem cell dysfunction may be that sometimes these stem cells start proliferating inappropriately and there's excessive proliferation. You can say there's a neoplastic change in these stem cells and they start proliferating inappropriately, and this condition is called leukemias. These conditions are called leukemias. How we define the leukemia? Leukemias are malignancies of hematopoietic precursor cells and stem cells. What are leukemias? Leukemias are malignancies of hematopoietic precursor cells and stem cells. So I was talking about that bone marrow stem cells, if they underfunction, they may lead to aplastic anemia. If they overproliferate, they may lead to leukemic situations. Is that right? Then there is another thing, that bone marrow provide a very important microenvironment for the proliferation and differentiation of these stem cells and precursor cells. bone marrow provides a very unique microenvironment for these stem cell, you can say, homing in, and stem cell survival, stem cell proliferation, and eventually their differentiation as well. Right? Now, how we know that bone marrow is so important, and what type of specialized microenvironment is provided by the bone marrow? Number one, in the bone marrow, there are, you can say, bone marrow stromal cell. They are very much unique in concentrating the growth factors which will influence on the stem cells and their derivatives. Again, let me tell you, in the bone marrow, there are a lot of stromal cells, or we can say these stromal cells support the hematopoietic process. Now, these stromal cells are basically capable of concentrating a lot of soluble factors, right, like erythropoietin, thrombopoietin, stem cell colony stimulating factor, or granulocyte, monocyte colony stimulating factors, or different type of interleukins, especially interleukin 3, which is responsible for stem cell proliferation. So all these are different soluble growth factors which can concentrate in the bone marrow, and bone marrow can help the, you can say, these stem cells and their derivatives with a lot of soluble factors, as well as the stromal cell have cell-to-cell interaction with the hematopoietic cells and direct their proliferation. Is that right? And direct their differentiation. Right? So let's go into detail of bone marrow. Right? But before we go into bone marrow, few important points related with the soluble factors. Some of the soluble factors which act as differentiation factors and growth factors for bone marrow stem cells and their derivatives. Some of these factors, as I mentioned, there are erythropoietin, there is thrombopoietin, there is stem cell colony stimulating factor, there is interleukin 3, interleukin 5, interleukin 6, interleukin 13. There's so many factors. But some of these have been synthesized by genetic recombinant technique, and now they are available for commercially available, these some of the soluble growth factors in the patients to be used. For example, erythropoietin is available. Erythropoietin is available, and you must be knowing erythropoietin is normally produced mainly by the kidneys. And in patient with chronic renal failure, patient develops severe deficiency of erythropoietin, and if there is severe deficiency of erythropoietin, erythropoiesis will become very slow, and person will develop severe type of anemia. So in chronic renal failure, we can give the patient injection of erythropoietin, which is commercially available. Then there is also now available thrombopoietin. Thrombopoietin is a soluble factor which help in the proliferation and differentiation of megakaryocyte system, and it help in production of thrombocytes, that is platelets. And thrombopoietin is also available commercially, and it is used for in some types of thrombocytopenias. Right? Then granulocyte monocyte colony stimulating factor is luckily also available. Granulocyte monocyte colony stimulating factor. This is specially used in patients who have neutropenia, right, or bone marrow suppression, and when you give the injection of granulocyte monocyte colony stimulating factor, it can increase the production of especially granulocytes, or right. Then recently a more advanced stage of this, that is only granulocyte colony stimulating factor, has also become available commercially. Right? So these are few examples in which I'm saying that these soluble growth factors and differentiation factors are now available they have been synthesized by genetic recombinant technique, right? And they are available to be used commercially in the patients. Erythropoietin to increase the erythropoiesis, thrombopoietin to increase the platelets production, granulocyte monocyte colony stimulating factor, and granulocyte colony stimulating factors, they especially is used in the patient where we want to increase the neutrophil numbers. Right? Then few more points related with the stem cells of the bone marrow. Now the stem cell, you see, it's very happy because we are constantly talking about it. Very, very happy. Right? So bone marrow stem cell, right? It has some more unique type of functions, bone marrow stem cell, that not only it is present in the bone marrow, but in very small amount, these bone marrow stem cells also circulate in peripheral blood. Is that right? And bone marrow stem cells love to stay, proliferate and differentiate into bone marrow, because bone marrow provides a unique, supportive environment for this. Right. So we can say bone marrow provide, number one, homing in tendency for these cells. Homing in means that if you release lot of bone marrow stem cell into circulation, eventually they will home in, or they will settle into bone marrow. Right? Advantage of this is because bone marrow stromal cell has special surface adhesion molecules, and I think these stem cells love those adhesion molecules which are present on the surface of the bone marrow stromal cells. So from the circulation, they love to settle into bone marrow microenvironment. Right? And the practical implication of this is that when you do bone marrow transplant, from donor you take the bone marrow, and you know where you inject the bone marrow? The donor's bone marrow is injected into veins of the recipient, and the stem cells in the veins of the recipient, right, they will circulate in all the blood, but they will not start settling into every tissue. They will specially settle into recipient's bone marrow, and there they will start, you can say, proliferating and surviving and then differentiating, is the right, and providing the patient with a lot of new RBCs, WBCs and platelets. So again, let me repeat it, that bone marrow transplantation, the donor's bone marrow is injected into recipient's venous system or in systemic circulation, and stem cells circulate all the body, but eventually they settle into bone marrow area, because bone marrow is giving them the best welcome situation. Bone marrow stroma is specialized in expressing the adhesion molecules where these stem cells will settle. Bone marrow stroma is specialized in concentrating different growth factors and differentiation factor, so that these stem cells can do hematopoietic function more efficiently in the bone marrow than any other tissue. Is that right? Then some interesting thing. Already we have seen that bone marrow stem cell produce RBCs, WBCs and platelets and many other tissue cells. They have seen that under certain circumstances, bone marrow stem cell can be induced to produce hemangioblast. Hemangioblast. What are hemangioblasts? Hemangioblasts are the cells, these are the cells which can differentiate into endothelial cells. So it means that bone marrow stem cells, they can differentiate into hemangioblasts. Then there are some very recent and controversial studies that bone marrow stem cell can produce non-hematopoietic cells. It can produce liver cells, hepatocytes. It can produce biliary system cells, biliary duct cell. Very surprisingly, bone marrow stem cell can produce myocardial cells. Myocardial cells, they can produce skeletal muscle cells. And then there was a shocking studies. Then some of the studies are proving that bone marrow stem cell can produce fully mature, neurons. This is a shocking news, because we never expected that bone marrow stem cell can produce neurons, and even it can produce glial cells. Is that right? So, okay, maybe one day these stem cells can be cultured, and then if someone get myocardial infarction, maybe in infarcted area we transplant these cells, and these cells in the infarcted area of myocardium may produce what? Myocardial new tissue. That will be a big breakthrough, right? So let the scientists work on that. We go back to our lecture, right? So let's talk about the anatomy of bone marrow, right? Some anatomical detail, anatomy of the bone marrow. Actually, bone marrow is made of a network of sinusoids, right? Bone marrow is made of network of sinusoids, and these sinusoids are lined by, you can say, these sinusoids are lined by endothelial cells, single layer of endothelial cells, right? These are the endothelial cells, and these endothelial cells are lining these, these are lining these sinusoids. These endothelial cells which are lining the bone marrow sinusoids, they are of course supported by a basement membrane. But this basement membrane is broken at many points. For example, right, at many points, this basement membrane is discontinuous or broken. Is that right? So this is the basic structure of bone marrow sinusoids. That bone marrow consists of lot of sinusoidal cells, sinusoidal channels, and these channels are usually one cell thick, endothelial cell thick, and these endothelial cells are supported by the basement membrane, and basement membrane is discontinuous or broken at multiple points. This is one thing. And of course, maybe this area is, what is this showing? This is the bone, right? Or this may be a piece of bone here. Is that right? Now, actually in between the sinusoids, there is, what is this? This is a functional area of the bone marrow, right? Here will be your hematopoiesis going on. That stem cell should be somewhere here, and this stem cell must be doing erythropoiesis. It must be doing, you can say, lymphopoiesis, granulopoiesis. All these processes continuing in these spaces. Space here, here, and here, right? So these are the areas where you can say, we call it the interstitium of the bone marrow, right? This interstitial area of the bone marrow are full of hematopoietic cells. These cells are derivative of stem cells and erythropoietic series cells, and hematopoietic, lymphopoietic, granulopoietic, and of course thrombopoietic system. One very interesting thing, the large thrombocytes, let's suppose this is multinucleated thrombocytes, these large, not thrombocyte, we should call the precursor cell, which is megakaryocyte or megakaryoblast. Megakaryoblast have finger-like processes which are extending into, these are extending into, through the sinusoids. These finger-like processes are extending into sinusoids, and when blood flow rapidly come from here, from here, these finger-like processes are broken away. And these finger-like processes which are broken away, they convert into, what? Platelets. These are the platelets. So you can say that megakaryocytes and megakaryoblasts, which are precursor cells for the platelets, they have their special cytoplasmic extension through the sinusoids into sinusoidal lumen, and blood, when it passes away, it breaks away some pieces of megakaryocytes, and these pieces are actually called platelets. Is that right? These are called platelets. Then another thing, that on the bony side here, especially, you may find granulocyte precursor cells. Right? And mature granulocytes will be somewhere in between, right? And of course, erythropoiesis is also continuing there. Maybe there is what is this? Erythroblast. And okay, let me show you how the erythroblast multiply. This is erythroblast, which is a large cell, right? And erythroblast has a large nucleus, and this nucleus has fine chromatin. It's a very fine chromatin, and it has blue cytoplasm. It has blue or basophilic cytoplasm. And proerythroblast has a size of about 20 microns. Then this will break down. Okay, let me make it black because I should not confuse. Okay, look. This is the erythroblast. Again, erythroblast has large nucleus with fine granular, you can say fine or open nucleus with fine chromatin nucleus and basophilic cytoplasm. Then what happens? Erythroblast goes into more differentiation, and cells become progressively smaller in size, right? For example, this is 20 micron, this is about 17 micron, this is about 14 micron, this is about 10 microns, and this may be 8 microns, and this 9 microns. When it comes into blood, it is 8 microns. When it becomes fully mature, it is 7 microns. You must be knowing I'm talking about RBC. Now, this is proerythroblast. As it matures, number one, their size changes. Progressively, size becomes smaller. Number two, nuclear changes. Nucleus become, yes, more condensed and smaller. And then it disappears because this nucleus come out of the cell and taken up by the macrophage. Right? This cell number one is proerythroblast. Cell number two is early basophilic normoblast. Why we call it normoblast and basophilic? Because it has blue cytoplasm. A hemoglobin is yet not significantly made. Very little hemoglobin is made, so its cytoplasm is still blue. But in next stage, when nucleus become condensed, this blue cytoplasm is showing some messenger RNA, but some hemoglobin is also made there. Right? We can focus over here that some hemoglobin is also made there. In next stage, nucleus is still in and very much condensed, and now lot of hemoglobin has been made and very little, you can say, basophilia is left. And in next stage, nucleus has come out, right, and it has made lot of, what is this, hemoglobinization of cytoplasm and very little basophilia. And now this cell is coming out. It is heavily hemoglobinized with very, very little fine network of basophilia. And then when the cell becomes totally mature, it is completely eosinophilic. Right? Now let me tell you. The cell number one is proerythroblast. Right? Characteristics of proerythroblast is, we will focus on this cell. Characteristics of proerythroblast is, it's a large cell with open nucleus or fine chromatin nucleus with basophilic cytoplasm. And at next stage, cell number 2. Cell number 2 is smaller. One was 20 micron, it is about 17 micron. Cell number 3 is 14 microns. Cell number 4 is 10 micron. Cell number 5 is 9 microns, 9 or 10 microns. And next cell is even smaller, right? 8 microns and then 7. Now listen. This was one is proerythroblast. This is early normoblast. This early normoblast, because its cytoplasm is finely basophilic or blue, so it is also called basophilic normoblast. What is it called? Basophilic. Pardon? Okay, no problem. I have a reason for that. Let's concentrate on our basic lecture. Again, listen. This was proerythroblast, right? What was the? Let's focus it properly, right? Proerythroblast. What is this? It's a large cell, right? And it is a fine chromatin, and it is having basophilic cytoplasm. Then it will go to the next stage. It will proliferate a lot. This cell can proliferate heavily, and then it will go to early normoblast. Early normoblast is having basophilia, heavy basophilic cytoplasm, and very little hemoglobin, almost non-existent, and this nucleus has condensed a little bit. Then in next stage, it is intermediate normoblast or normocyte. This is early, this is intermediate, this is late. Now, when we come to the intermediate cell, still some cytoplasm is basophilic due to messenger RNA presence, and this is basophilic due to, let's suppose, protein synthesis, but it has a lot of protein formed already, and due to that protein which is formed, that is hemoglobin, it starts showing the shade of pink color also. So it's bluish pink cell. So we also call it what cells? Polychromatic normocyte. Poly mean multiple, chromatic mean color. So it's a normocyte which can show multiple color. It shows the cytoplasm shows the shade of blue as well as it shows the shade of pink. But when it further mature, its nucleus becomes very condensed and it is heavily hemoglobinized. Very little network of basophilia is there. It is well hemoglobinized and its nucleus is about to leave. Right? Either it will disappear with pycnosis or it will be fed to the macrophages. And then the cell is left without nucleus, and now this newly formed cell is called reticulocyte. and reticulocyte will eventually appear into circulation. Within 1-2 days or 3 days, it will mature into mature RBC. Now the point which I want to remind you, that from proerythroblast up to mature RBC, there's a progressive size decrease. That during this process, size keep on decreasing. Proerythroblast is 20 to 21 microns, early normoblast is 17 to 18 micron, then intermediate is about 12 to 14 micron, then late is about 10 microns, and reticulocyte is 8 to 9 microns, and when it comes into circulation, it is 7 to 8 microns mature RBC. So there's progressive decrease in size, point number 1. Point number 2, which is worth focusing over here, is that first cytoplasm is basophilic, and progressively basophilia disappears and eosinophilia appears. That is why early normoblast is basophilic, late normocyte is eosinophilic, but intermediate is polychromatic. Third thing is nucleus condenses and then disappear. Now, the two important things, that nucleus has to condense and mature and disappear. For nuclear maturation and condensation, we really need B12 and folic acid. These two vitamins are must. In erythropoiesis, B12 and folic acid is must for nuclear maturation. If you have severe deficiency of B12 or folic acid, then you can still make hemoglobin, but you cannot make enough DNA and nucleus remains open. For example, this cell, if there's B12 or folic acid, this cell will be having excessive amount of hemoglobin, but nucleus will remain, what is this? Fine chromatic. And it is well hemoglobinized. So this is not a normal normoblast. Because this normoblast is producing more hemoglobin. Why? Because B12 and folic acid is not there. Nucleus cannot be matured. Nucleus cannot make DNA, but it keep on making RNA. RNA keep on making hemoglobin. So it is over-hemoglobinized normocyte or normoblast. This over-hemoglobinized normoblast becomes larger cell. So we also call it megaloblast. So megaloblast are abnormal normoblast, which are found. Megaloblasts are abnormal normoblasts, which are found in bone marrow when there is severe B12 or folic acid deficiency. How we define megaloblast? Megaloblasts are larger size normoblasts, which are heavily, you can say, hemoglobinized, or you can say they are having a larger amount of eosinophilic cytoplasm, and nuclear cytoplasm is over mature, but nucleus is under mature, because whenever cytoplasm is hemoglobinized, nucleus should be condensed. Nuclear maturation means nucleus should be condensed. Cytoplasmic maturation means cytoplasm should be well hemoglobinized. Basophilia should convert into eosinophilia, right? Here we have seen cytoplasm is really mature because basophilic cytoplasm has been converted into eosinophilic cytoplasm. But unfortunately, due to deficiency of B12 and folic acid, nucleus is not mature. It's immature nucleus, right? It is out of phase. So we can say cytoplasmic and nuclear maturation are dysynchronized. They are out of phase. We have an immature nucleus due to deficiency of B12 and folic acid, but we are having over-hemoglobinized cell and larger cell, so we call it megaloblast. These cells, most of these cells are destroyed within the bone marrow, and they don't result into formation of lot of RBCs. So total RBCs in blood become less, and we say there's anemia. But whatever RBCs are formed, they are larger size. So we call it macrocytic, because few RBCs are made, that is why anemia. But whatever few RBCs are made, they are larger in size, so they are macrocyte. But in the bone marrow, we have megaloblast. So B12 and folic acid deficiency can lead to megaloblastic macrocytic anemia. Megaloblastic means megaloblast in bone marrow. Macrocytic means larger RBCs in circulation, but total hemoglobin is less than normal, so we call it anemia, right? So this was something about, right, that early normoblast is called basophilic normoblast, then intermediate is called polychromatic normocyte, and late is called eosinophilic normocyte. But in B12 and folic acid deficiency, nucleus does not mature. If nucleus remain immature and cytoplasm is overly mature, then it is called megaloblast. Is that clear? Right? So what we need for the erythropoiesis, we do need specifically B12 and folic acid for nuclear maturation. And of course, good doctors always remember that for cytoplasmic maturation, we need iron, because cytoplasmic maturation means formation of hemoglobin. And you know, hemoglobin cannot be formed without iron. So it means that for erythropoiesis, we need B12 and folic acid for nuclear maturation, and we need iron for hemoglobinization of cytoplasm or maturation of cytoplasm. Is that right? So hemoglobin synthesis required cytoplasm, but then there are other factors, because these cells are multiplying a lot. They are metabolically very active. So this erythropoietic tissue or hematopoietic tissue also require thyroid hormones to maintain the metabolism. Then they need growth hormones, right? And plus they need a lot of amino acid to incorporating into in the proteins which are made. They need a lot of amino acids. It means person should not have protein energy malnutrition to have good erythropoiesis, because if proteins are there, if amino acids are there, only then these cells can take up the proteins and then synthesize their own proteins, like they can take up the amino acid and make hemoglobin, right? Then we can talk about this. This was about erythropoiesis, and here we can talk about what is this? You can say granulopoiesis. In granulopoiesis, there are also cells which pass through different stages. The very immature cell is called, in granulopoiesis, very immature cell is called, yes, that is called myeloblast. Myeloblast. And these myeloblasts convert into next cell, and these cells are called promyelocyte. Promyelocytes. And promyelocytes mature into next stage of the white granulocyte, which are called myelocyte. And myelocytes go into immature neutrophils and eventually into mature neutrophils. Let me repeat it again, that the myeloblasts in the bone marrow, right, they convert into promyelocyte, they mature into myelocyte, and then eventually into granulocyte and neutrophils. Is that right? So in the bone marrow, we can say bone marrow is just a network of what? Lot of sinusoids, and in between the sinusoid, in the interstitium, there is lymphopoiesis going on, there is granulopoiesis going on, there is erythropoiesis going on. And ratio of these cells, granulopoiesis makes 65% of these cells approximately. Erythropoiesis make about 25% of these cells. Is that right? And lymphopoiesis make approximately 10% of the cells. So hematopoietic tissue is present in the interstitium in between the sinusoids, not within the sinusoids, outside the sinusoids, and they consist of granulopoietic tissue, erythropoietic tissue, lymphopoietic tissue. Granulopoietic tissue is about 65%, erythropoietic cells, of course all these cells are erythropoietic, erythropoiesis related cells are about 25% of bone marrow, active bone marrow, and lymphopoietic cells are 10%. And some people talk about myeloid erythroid ratio, and that is usually about 3:1, right? Because granulopoiesis is more than erythropoiesis. This is one thing. Secondly, when you want to study the bone marrow, what you do? There are two types of studies in the bone marrow. Number one, you can do bone marrow aspiration, and then there is bone marrow biopsy, bone marrow Triffin biopsy. Let me tell you about aspiration first. Bone marrow aspiration, we pass a needle in the sternum in the iliac crest, usually interior iliac crest, but you can use posterior iliac crest also. So in bone marrow aspiration needle aspirates the bone marrow, and then fresh bone marrow is applied on the slides, and smears are produced and stained, right? But you can say that sometimes in bone marrow there may be fibrosis, right? For example, in granulomatous diseases, or when bone marrow is involved by a lot of metastatic infiltration, then a lot of fibrosis occur, or there's a disease called myelofibrosis, bone marrow fibrosis occur. Under these circumstances, when you aspirate from bone marrow, there is dry tap. Dry tap means that nothing comes out. Dry tap. Tap is really dry. Nothing is to be aspirated. No aspiration fails. Right? Under these circumstances, then we have to take bone marrow biopsy. This is wide bore needle, Triffin biopsy also called. Usually it is taken from posterior iliac crest, and in the biopsy material, then it will be prepared like tissue will be fixated, and then it will be decalcified, then it will be studied. Bone marrow biopsy, due to tissue fixation technique, and when we try to decalcify the bone, number one, it takes 7-8 days. Number two, it modifies a lot of cells, right? And they become difficult to recognize. But it's easy recognition of the different type of cells in bone marrow aspiration. But histopathology of bone marrow and bone can be better understood on bone marrow biopsy, right? Another important thing which I would love to mention, that sometimes, most of the emitted stem cell, they are very similar. We cannot tell really, you can tell a big difference in advanced, well-differentiated stage of erythrocyte or well-differentiated stage of granulocyte, but you cannot really tell the difference in the stem cells or difference in the precursor cells. And so how do you define that a particular precursor cell? Is it erythroid precursor cell or is this myeloid precursor cell? Very easy. Precursor cells are recognized by the company they keep. If there is a precursor cell, immature cell, right, precursor cell surrounded by erythroid mature cells, it means this is a precursor of erythroid series. And if there is a precursor cell here and it is surrounded by, you can say, granulopoietic cells, then it must be precursor of granulopoietic system. Is that right? So again, let me tell you how we recognize the blast cells or very precursor cells. We recognize them by the company they keep, that if there's a blast cell surrounded by the erythroid derivatives, well-differentiated erythroid derivatives, probably it is erythroblast. And if there is blast cell surrounded by granulopoietic series, mature cells, then probably this is you can say myeloblast. Last but not the least, that how these mature cells leap from bone marrow interstitium to sinusoids, right? Answer is that these reticulocyte or these granulocyte or lymphocytes or all the mature product, they pass through the endothelial cells. They pass through the endothelial cells. This is called transcellular migration. Again, the differentiated blood cells from the bone marrow areas shift to the bone marrow sinusoid through the transcellular migration through the endothelial cells, and they become the part of general circulation. And here I should mention something, that RBCs which come into general circulation, their average lifespan is around 120 days, right? The lifespan of neutrophils, right? Just few important cells. Lifespan of, before the neutrophil, I should mention lifespan of platelets. Platelets lifespan is about 7 to 8 days. So you can say RBCs lives for months. Platelets lives for 1 week or days. And then we come to the neutrophil. Neutrophil have a very short lifespan. They live only for 24 to 48 hours in circulation. And if neutrophils are really fighting during the inflammatory process, their life is reduced to 6 to 7 hours, right? But don't forget your friends like lymphocytes. Some of the lymphocytes, memory lymphocytes, may have the life of decades, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, right? So